So, as I said earlier, we're having a look at the Old Testament book of Malachi. Malachi means messenger. It's not necessarily the name of the prophet. Maybe that he's actually, or she is unnamed. And this is simply the messenger of God. Last week we saw that the people Malachi were speaking to were going through all the outward signs of faith, simply not taking it seriously. They were doing all the things that God's people were expected to do, and their heart just wasn't in it. And God had quite harsh words for the leaders of the people, but also for the people themselves. And so it is that reminder to us that as we come to church week by week, it's best if we come genuinely to meet with God. And also a reminder that worship is not just something we do on a Sunday. It's a whole of life thing. I think there are folk who are a bit like a salesman I read about. He was in an office waiting to see the purchasing manager for a company, and he was there to submit a bid that his company had made. So while he's waiting, he couldn't help but notice that the purchasing manager had left a bid from a rival company on his desk. The problem was the total was covered by a can of Coke. So he thinks, nobody there. It's not going to hurt, really, is it? I mean, our bid's here anyway. Can't really do much about it, but it'd be good to know what they had. So, and he stretched over and he picked it up to have a look, at which point thousands of tiny BB pellets came out the bottom of the can, all over the desk and onto the floor. There was no hiding what he had done. Needless to say, didn't get the contract. It was a test of integrity set up by the purchasing manager, and he failed. That's kind of about morality and behaving well. But we also use that word integrity in another way. A bridge, we say, has integrity when it does what it was designed to do. Cars, trains, or people can travel across a bridge without it collapsing. And in that sense, we would say the bridge has integrity. Now, it's not about morality. It's about doing and being the thing that you were intended for. It's the ability to function according to an intended design. And both of those are kind of relevant to what Malachi is talking about here, because it's both doing what you're meant to do and being what you're meant to be. So it's both those ideas of integrity. He's had to speak to a variety of sins amongst the clergy and the people. In chapter 1, he focused on their cheap worship, their sort of contempt for the sacrifice and the ritual that was involved in that. And then the second half of chapter 2, as I said earlier, he talks about divorce and marriage to unbelievers. And somehow the folk had got the idea that these things weren't really serious. They weren't proper sins. So they could get away with it. They had grown comfortable with the sin. And that relates to this main problem that's identified today. Malachi then, at the beginning of the chapter 2, turns to lay blame where it belongs, with the priests or the ministers. Blaming the priest, however, for the problem doesn't let everybody else off the hook. They were responsible for their own sin, even if they were unaware of what the Bible had said about it, because ignorance is never an excuse for breaking God's law. But the guilt is far greater on those who by their wrong teaching or their lack of teaching caused God's people to stumble. The priests weren't functioning with integrity according to the intended purpose, and Malachi, or God, says it was going to cost them. he begins with this bold, direct confrontation. And now you priests, this warning is for you. Imagine that. Imagine going to the General Assembly. Right? You'll understand. You've got 750 delegates, people up in the public gallery. Right? And somebody stands up and goes, all you folk from the Church of Scotland, this word is for you. Can you just imagine the uproar? There would be people trying to throw you out. But what if there was a word for that gathering? What if this year or next year or some year, God had called somebody to go and say, you're worried about your money, you're worried about your numbers, you're worried about your buildings, why don't you worry about me for a change? Why don't you stop all this talk and spend time in prayer? I don't know if it would make a difference. I don't know if it would do any harm. But imagine then this temple filled with priests and lawyers and all the people there. And all of a sudden, Malachi, the prophet, stands up and speaks directly and bluntly, fairly bluntly, as you read through, and tells them what God has said. They might have anticipated, of course, that he would be critical of something, because prophets often were. But I suspect they had no idea really what was coming. This announcement, I suspect, would have incensed that audience. Probably there in their clean white garments. You see, later in the New Testament, Jesus talks about the Pharisees who go out onto the street corner with their painted faces and their best clothes, saying, look at me, I'm a Pharisee, look at this, it's great. And that's kind of what they're doing. And Malachi gets right through that. And do you know what? They obviously didn't learn their lesson. Because 400 years later, you get Pharisees out in the street with their painted faces. But God, in this chapter, is saying they were unclean, they were disqualified, and they were not welcome in the holy place. Because God removes his ministers who refuse to honor his name. Either literally or metaphorically. It's a message about integrity and honoring God. There have been so many books written about the name of God and what the name of God is and how to understand the name of God, and it's far too complicated to get into today. But it's really, essentially, God's name is tied up with his character and his identity. God's name is who he is. And so if we're not honoring his name, we're not honoring him. And that was their problem. They no doubt thought that they were giving God the glory because they were saying and doing all the right things in their worship ritual. But their heart wasn't in it, and they weren't doing it in a way that honored and exalted God. There were three basic duties the priests then had to perform. One was to teach the law of God, which clearly they were not doing. They were to burn incense during the times of prayer, and they were to make atoning sacrifices for the people. All of that, as we saw earlier on, involves being right with God. And so it wasn't working. And then later on you get this, God saying, you come and you weep and you wail and you moan and you go on about why it's not working well. It's not working because you're not right with me. Malachi 2:2. If you do not listen, and if you do not resolve to honor my name, God's will regarding priestly duties had been presented a number of times. That, from the tabernacle, God told, here's what the priests are supposed to do. And then through the life and times of the children of Israel, God has said, here's what the priests are supposed to do. And the temple is destroyed and it's rebuilt. At which time, what happens? They go through all of the law again that says, here's what the priests are supposed to do. So they'd heard it. They'd heard it. But this phrase, if you don't listen and if you don't resolve, that phrase is used 4 more times in the Old Testament. And it carries the thought of caring about or understanding the things of God so that your life honors him. You care about the things of God and it affects your behavior and your attitude. So they weren't honoring God because they weren't listening properly. Listening results in action. And so God says to them, this lack of that attitude, that listening and honoring him results in a curse. Now, that is not God doing some kind of TV type hocus pocus thing, zap, we'll curse you and blah, blah, blah. It's not that kind of stuff at all. This idea of curse is essentially, it means to remove or banish from the place of blessing. So God's saying to them, you were in the place where you should have been blessed, where your land is fertile, it could have been producing crops, where you could be having wine, where you could be doing all that stuff, and actually you're in the place of blessing, but you have chosen to ignore me, and therefore you are under a curse. So all that stuff that was yours by right because you're mine, actually, I'm taking from you and I'm withholding from you. And that's the curse. But it's not just that. It says he'll curse their blessings. If God cursed their blessings, it meant that he was going to render them unfit for ministry, or that they would have no effective ministry even if they stayed in office. And then it ends up in verse 9, saying God was going to make these priests contemptible in the eyes of the people. Malachi chapter 2 verse 3 says, then, because of you I will rebuke your descendants. Because of the sins of these priests, their family line would be stopped from being priests. That had happened before in the history of Israel. In the days of Samuel, when God removed Eli and his sons from the priesthood and chose another family line to be priests, because being priests was an honor. The second half of the verse is graphically clear. He said to the priests, I will smear. So this is one of these places where our modern versions tend to be a bit more polite. You get it in Philippians as well, where Paul says, he considers all of the things that he used to hold dear and he used to value as, well, actually, the word is shit. Right? But that's not a word that we use in church. It's an offensive word. But that's what it is. That's the extent to which God is saying, I hate what you're doing or you're not doing, and I'm going to cover you in that. Now, I suspect, I hope that the smearing on of the dung on your face is figurative. I hope he's not really going to give them a manure makeover. Although I suspect nowadays there might be people who would pay for that. It is hyperbole. It's making a point, but it's a really serious point. It's also an implied comparison. They were to be treated the same as the unclean bits of the animals that they were bringing for sacrifice. God was saying that since they were spiritually unclean, they were unfit for the sanctuary, and they deserved to be carried out with the dung to the rubbish heap. That's pretty intense stuff for these people who are supposed to be leading God's people. Essentially, he's saying, effectively, their ministry is over. Because God is already full of glory, the only way human beings can really properly glorify him is by extending and expanding the knowledge of God in the world. By causing him to be seen in all that we do. If his people habitually sin or fail in doing what they're supposed to do, in terms of what God wants for worship and service, then God is not glorified in that. But actually what happens is people get the wrong impression about God. If you sit with faces that are tripping you, saying, God is wonderful, we love God so much, what actually are people seeing? They might hear the words, but your behavior says something different. And they get the wrong impression about God. I've no idea how often I've sat in a service making little or no effort to engage with what's going on, or being critical of what is being said or the way things are being done. And none of that has brought glory to God. I give David a copy of the reading for the week. And David goes and chooses appropriate things for us to sing. And that works amazingly. When I tell other ministers that I do that, they're astounded because they do it all themselves. It works amazingly well. To be honest, this week, I looked at the list and I thought to myself, this doesn't fill me with joy. I don't like these songs. I want some more modern songs. And I hope you notice that there are at least two things wrong with that attitude. The first one is, it must be incredibly difficult to find music that's appropriate for Malachi. And so it's really disrespectful to the effort that David has made in choosing music. And so I'm sorry about that. I know you didn't know, but it does work amazingly well. And the music is such a big part of worship. And to treat it like that is not right. It's easy to look around and see Christian leaders and be critical. But actually, the second thing that was wrong with that during the week was, it's all about me. I don't want, I prefer. It's not about us and how we honor God in our worship. It was a bad attitude to approach worship with. Sometimes our criticism of Christian leaders is justified. To the guy who asked his followers for money for a second jet so that he could more effectively pursue his ministry. Do you think, really? Sometimes it's just down to our own bad attitude. And maybe you're sitting there thinking, what on earth has this got to do with us in 2019? Well, the thing is, the Bible tells us that you and I are priests. You and I are priests. 1 Peter 2:9. But you are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people belonging to God, and for a purpose. And what is that purpose? That you may declare the praises of him who called you out of darkness and into his wonderful light. That you and I might tell people what it is to be a child of God and the benefits that we have and the difference that God has made in our life. You and I are called to be priests. And just in case you're thinking, that's only Peter, what did he know? He used to shout his mouth off and he often got it wrong. Well, there's another one in Revelation, and it wasn't Peter this time, it was John. And Christ has made us to be a kingdom and priests to serve his God forever. So here's how the passage relates to our lives today. Every believer is a priest, and as such is set apart for worship and service. And just as priests in the Old Testament were to point people to God, so you and I are expected to point people to God. The description in verses 5 and 6 of what a priest should be simply didn't fit priests in Malachi's day. That says there, my covenant was with Levi, with him, a covenant of life and peace, and I gave them to him. This called for reverence, and he revered me and stood in awe of my name. True instruction was in his mouth, and nothing false was found in his lips. He walked with me in peace and in uprightness, and turned many from sin. Life and peace, reverence, awe, true instruction, uprightness were to be the hallmarks of those people who serve God. And they're to be identifying marks for us today. James chapter 1, 22 says this, do not merely listen to the word and so deceive yourselves. Do what it says. We spent months in the early part of this year thinking about how we could encourage people to move just a little bit closer to God, to take that step closer to him. And it happens when we just stop just listening and put our faith into action. I hear it so often, the kind of nonsense of, I don't know enough You'll never know enough. Do you know, there's always other things to learn, and there's always going to be somebody who knows more than you. It's not about what you know, it's about who you know. Or, I'm too old. Well, Moses was 80 at the burning bush. And who knows how long it took him to get to Egypt and then to do all the stuff with Pharaoh and all the stuff, and then had 40 odd years in the desert. You're not too old, because none of you have got to that age yet. I don't have time. Don't have time for God. I'm just going to leave that one there. As believers, our worship, whether that's here on a Sunday, at work on a Monday, on the beach of an evening, or wherever we are, should be from the heart. It should engage body, mind, and spirit, and it should make a difference in our lives, so much so that other people see it and say, I want what they've got. I want a bit of that. We teach by our words, of course we do, but we also teach by our lives. And sometimes our life undermines the message. It's as if we're saying, people say, I can't hear you because I see you. And what we see isn't attractive. God's people must know, must teach, and must obey his word so that we can bring honor and glory and praise to him, and life and peace to the people that we're called to serve. That's you and me, all of us, called as priests to worship and to serve the Lord. One of the other names of Jesus is the great high priest. And when you get into reading the book of Hebrews, it talks so much about Jesus. And the Old Testament makes all those links as to how Jesus was the sacrificial lamb and how he takes away sin and blah, all that stuff. It's brilliant, absolutely brilliant. But it reminds us that that priesthood that he has is a royal priesthood because he's king and priest. And the work that he's done is good for now and for all time. It was the one sacrifice that enables us to be forgiven. It's the one sacrifice that dealt with sin. It's the one resurrection that means he reigns in glory forever. And so I did change the last hymn today because I wanted us to finish with Jesus, the great high priest and King of kings and Lord of lords.